Let me ask you a question. Do you know Sturgeon's Law? No, not that Sturgeon. This is Theodore Sturgeon, a prominent science fiction writer of the mid 20th century. He wrote hundreds of reviews and dozens of short stories, alongside a plethora of novels and scripts too. In his heyday of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, science fiction, though popular, was often lauded by critics to be nothing more than pulpy trash. Sturgeon replied to this criticism in a 1958 issue of Venture magazine with the adage, 90% of everything is crud. All things. Cars, books, cheeses, hairstyles, people, and pins are, to the expert and discerning eye, crud, except for the acceptable tith which we each happen to like. This principle would come to be known as Sturgeon's Law. And there is perhaps no better medium today to observe Sturgeon's Law than through video games. I don't need to explain myself here. You know a bad game when you see it. Picture the bargain bin at Walmart, the gaudy CD cases of detective games, or the inevitable movie tie-ins. The games that parents pick up without a second thought because they're cheap, or they got a character they know on them. It's even easier to see Sturgeon's Law in the mobile game market. Bad games today make their presence known through aggressive ad campaigns on the apps we use daily. Their appearance has changed, but awful video games are as strong as ever. But out of every video game system, home console or handheld, which has the best collection of bad games? I know my answer. To me, it's not even a question. In the vast, vast sea of shovelware and plastic trash, one system's collection stands above the rest. Or below the rest. Its release, timed near prophetically at an inflection point in consumer culture. Its design, both unorthodox and wholly intuitive, and its popularity, so colossal that no human could ever experience all the garbage it has to offer. Indeed, you probably know what I'm talking about. You likely had one of your own. The king of trash, the emperor of plastic rubbish, the captain of dog shit. It's the Nintendo DS.
Well, the wait is over. This is Nintendo DS.
The DS released worldwide in 2004 and stayed on shelves until 2011. Within that 7-year time span, a paradigm shift in how games were made and consumed occurred in the industry. With the benefit of hindsight, one can see that the DS occupied a fragile space in time, where game releases, good and bad, were accessible enough for a wide audience without imposing predatory mechanics seen in the games of today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me rewind. The video game industry has been constantly evolving since its inception. To help categorize the advancements in technology, game design, and consumer culture, we lump consoles into generations. The long and short of it is this. To be a bad game in the first few generations, your game would be hard to understand and it'd just look ugly. But improvements in game design and general cultural knowledge allowed bad games in later generations to at least be serviceable, you know? By and large, you could understand what was going on. A base layer of competency was established. It was at this point where the DS was born. As noted by Forrest Greenwood in their dissertation, The Nintendo DS Platform, a multidisciplinary study, quote, the DS sits at something of an awkward middle distance between the sprite-based graphics pipelines of the 1980s game consoles and the volumetric 3D graphics that dominate games today. But a greater change than merely graphics occurred in the post-DS gaming landscape. With the arrival of the 6th, 7th, and 8th generations of consoles came a heavy focus on digital distribution and online multiplayer. Simply put, game monetization had been flipped on its head. Now not only could a studio release a sucky game, but they could ask you to pay more even after you bought the game. As such, this leaves the DS in a precarious position. The language of games, both visually and intuitively, was more accessible to mainstream audiences. But it had not reached a point where unfinished or predatory game design was encouraged. By no means am I saying that the DS was immune to bad game design. It definitely wasn't. That's what this whole video is about, you know? What I'm trying to say is that the handheld's technological capabilities in both what it was able to do and what it couldn't do, alongside the general trends of game design at the time, it optimized the release of bad games on the DS platform. And I haven't even touched on the design.
Nintendo DS. Chat wirelessly, play wirelessly.
Okay, this commercial is ridiculous. Touching is good? Touching is, when I first saw that, I'm like, what? But yeah, that was a slogan that the guys came up with. Touching is good. But you need to remember, the DS launched in 2004. USA Today compared the design of the DS to a PDA. Utilizing a touchscreen at all, nevertheless for gaming, was completely uncharted territory. And that's to say nothing of the two screens. Yeah, there's two screens. DS, dual screen. Even if the bottom feeder trash released for the DS was hard to play or boring or just not even a game, by pure virtue of the dual screen, touch control design of the DS, game designers, good or bad, were forced to be creative. In a similar way to how the DS launched at a pivotal moment in game design, the same can be said for its touchscreen. Games on the handheld live at an impasse between the classic game controls of past systems, with its D-pad and 4 buttons, and the mobile game landscape of today, with intuitive touchscreen controls. So even if your game was garbage, it wasn't a game you could replicate on any other system. Not that you need to anyway, because the DS sold like hotcakes.
Will sales of the Nintendo DS ever slow down? One look at this list and the answer is an obvious no.
Due in equal parts to the portability, Wi-Fi connectivity, game selection, and appeal to the casual gaming market, the DS sold crazy. When all was said and done, all DS models combined sold 154 million units. What this meant for the DS was that a lot of games are made. And with Sturgeon's Law holding true, most of those games really, really sucked. Every market, every market was capitalized upon. If you were from ages 2 to 102, there was a game on the DS made for you. And this is to say nothing of DSiWare, the download-only selection of games for later models of DS. Hundreds upon hundreds of games were released in total, and you can bet that a giant sector of those games were total, complete, utter garbage. But hey, if you're looking for a system to play a lot of trash games on, then look no further. As I was reading the Nintendo DS multidisciplinary study that I referenced earlier, I came across one part where Forrest Greenwood quoted film historian David Bordwell. Film historians have not typically acknowledged the place of the typical work. In most film histories, masterworks and innovations rise monumentally out of a hazy terrain whose contours remain unknown. In other arts, however, the ordinary work is granted considerable importance. Academicism, mainstream works, the canon, tradition, the history of music, painting, and literature could not do without such conceptions. My analysis of the norms of the classical style thus gives privileged place not to the aberrant film that breaks or tests the rules, but to the quietly conformist film that tries simply to follow them. The same principle applies to video games. Listen, we can talk all day about Ocarina of Time or Super Mario 64 or Red Dead Redemption, but at the end of the day, Sturgeon's Law holds true. The vast majority of games are ass. But that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to be looked at. Think of the games that you had when you were a kid. You didn't choose them, you just were given to you, and half the time they were not good. They were franchise tie-in, carnival fever. But listen, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't get talked about or they shouldn't be played, because they hold a incredibly valuable place in our history and our culture. Trash video games hold valuable discoveries in how we interact with the technology around us, how popular culture is transposed virtually, and how media is designed for children. Really, the implications are limitless. Look, if I'm going to observe trash games anywhere, I'd want it to be the DS. Because I know that the game that I'll play will be better than a game I get on my phone, and also better than some super old Game Boy game, unless it's Tetris or Oracle of Ages. I mean, there's a lot of good ones, but like there's a lot of bad ones too. At least on the DS, they'll be somewhat interesting due to the innate creativity of the DS's design. The two screens you really just aren't able to replicate anywhere else. And I will never run out of shitty games to try because there's way too many for me to ever play all in my lifetime. So is this just nostalgia talking? Yes. At the end of the day, even if the games suck, I can just shut the console, stick it in my pocket, and forget about it. And hey, isn't that the real magic? I'm sure if Sturgeon were alive today, he'd be proud of all the shovelware on the DS.